Do you have friends and family that often stay over but you don't have enough space for a dedicated guest bedroom? Or maybe you and the spouse had an argument and you don't want to sleep on the couch tonight. Well, if that's the case, then I have the solution for you. Enter the Murphy bed.
We hope that you'll stay tuned and we'll show you how to build one of these yourself.
First off, let's start with some housekeeping. While this video will show you how we built this bed frame and cabinet to house this Murphy bed, what it doesn't show and what I did not do is build the mechanical mechanisms that make pivoting this bed possible. For that, I bought a kit. There are a bunch of different brands out there and a bunch of different configurations depending on the bed size that you're looking for. I used Conceal The Bed, and this is for a queen vertical mattress that stands up tall. They do make a horizontal version out there for those of you that have lower ceilings or can't fit something like this in your current setup. But for the purposes of this video, if you want to follow along exactly step by step of what I did, I highly recommend you get your mattress from Conceal The Bed. I'm not sponsored by them in any way. I used my own money to buy this, but it was a very easy process and they send you everything you need and some clear dimensions and instructions for the pieces that you'll be cutting. First step in the Murphy bed build was to break down the sheets of plywood into all of the individual pieces that we will need. Now, if you are using the Conceal The Bed kit like I was, it has a detailed cut list and they even organize the pieces by plywood sheet to try and help you minimize the number of sheets that you need to use. Score 1 point for that with the prices we are currently seeing for plywood these days. The one downside of this though is that the plans have some pretty tight tolerances on a few cuts and you don't want to mess them up. For me, it was enough of a reason to upgrade my circular saw cutability and accuracy. Now, I still was not ready to drop the kind of money needed to buy a nice dedicated track saw. So instead, I opted for the Miles Craft track saw guide rails. And I have to say, so far, I can't recommend them enough to people on a budget and not ready to buy a track saw. I'm not sponsored by them. And once again, I used my own money to purchase this equipment. But it's great because it can mount any standard circular saw onto it and turn your current circular saw into a track saw. One tip I do have for cutting plywood is to use sacrificial boards underneath to make it easy to cut without worrying about your saw blade or what is underneath the plywood. I built these stands out of 2x4s. I've seen a lot of people using insulation boards or foam as the sacrificial piece, but I've found that causes a ton of mess every time you cut. 2x4s are super affordable, and at the time of recording this audio, I have been using these same boards to cut stuff for about a year now and still haven't had to replace them. Now, while most of the Murphy bed is built out of plywood, there are a few pieces where using natural wood was recommended, such as the support pieces underneath the mattress and the fascia around the outside of the bed to disguise it as a cabinet. In my case, I went with some rough sawn oak boards I had bought locally. I started by planing them down to get them surfaced appropriately. With the oak planed, I ripped and cut it to the size pieces that I would need. Now, the first pieces that you're going to need for assembly are for the support structure underneath your mattress. This means that the dimensions you need to cut things to are dependent to the size mattress you are using for your Murphy bed. Again, check against any plans you bought. Once all of my pieces were cut, it was on to the fun part, assembly. Like I said, we start with the support structure underneath the mattress. To build this structure, I used 2 pieces of oak to form an L shape that would strengthen and add rigidity to the bed support. For my queen size mattress, I needed to make 5 of these L-shaped support struts. With my L support brackets built, I marked where they would mount onto the side rails and then screwed them into place, taking the time to pre-drill and countersink each of my holes since we were screwing into the end grain of these thin oak hardwood rails and we don't want to cause any splitting. After putting 1 screw in each side to hold the support frame together, I tipped the whole thing up to save my back and knees some aches, and reinforced each piece with an additional screw in each side so it could not pivot. Starting with the bed side rails, at the foot of the bed you will need to attach some type of leg support so that your whole bed does not crash down to the floor when someone falls onto it, like I did at the start of this video. For most kits out there, a set of handy concealed legs are included. These legs are able to pivot out when you lay the Murphy bed down, but they also fold back inside of the cabinet frame with the rest of the bed so that you don't have to see them when the bed is stored. Following the plans that I got, I had to drill a 5/8 diameter hole about a half an inch deep into my side rails at a specific point from the foot of the bed. Once again, check your plans for specifics or any differences to my plans. You know what? To save us all some time, I'm going to stop saying to double check your plans. I then went ahead and dry fitted my leg support into the hole I drilled and used it to mark where I would need to drill for the provided screws and bolts. Presumably, for the added structural stability, Create a Bed has used both wood screws mounting directly to the wood and bolts with threaded inserts that go all the way through the wood. So I drilled pilot holes for the screws and then 1/4 inch holes all the way through the side rail for the threaded inserts. Now, on the Create a Bed plans, you have to round over the top corner of the foot of your side rails. Well, all in all, this Murphy bed is a pretty easy build that I would say even a beginner woodworker could tackle with the right tools. I will say that these two cuts are probably the most technically challenging parts of the entire build. Create a Bed does give you a paper template to cut to, but unless you are going to do something super fancy and build your own template and use a flush trim router bit, you are likely going to be cutting this by freehand. It's not hard to cut a curve by freehand. What is hard is to cut a smooth curve. What I did was to cut just outside of my traced line using my jigsaw, and then I came back with my sander to sand down to my line exactly and smooth out the curve. At the head of the side rail, we need to mount two pieces of hardware. The first is the lower connector for the shocks that make it easy to open and close this bed. This piece right here is one of the main reasons I chose Create a Bed. Out of all the Murphy beds I looked at, their ease and adjustability was the best in my opinion. Now, like most of the hardware in this kit, we need to mount this piece using 2 screws and 2 more threaded bolts. So I drilled all of those out. The second piece of hardware is the pivot point that will allow the full bed frame to rotate down from the cabinet when you and your guests need to use the bed. For the Create a Bed kit I bought, you need to drill a 1-inch diameter pivot hole through your side rail piece to mount your pivot hardware to. Once both of those items were drilled for, I mounted them onto my side rails. One important thing to note during the assembly is that the pivot point mounts on the outside of your side rail while the shock mount mounts on the inside of your side rail. With the hardware mounted to the side rails and both the header and footer of the bed frame already ready to go from when we broke down the plywood, I moved on to attaching the frame to our oak supports. I'd like to ask that if you're enjoying this video to please subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. It really will help us grow.
Tell me up and you say it's all for the best. I will show you the way. It's not how it's done, at least not for me. 'Cause I need my freedom like I need my air to breathe. And I need a renegotiation. And we need to figure out a way to love like we did before. Like we did before. Say you're lying, not cheap. Now I'm getting sad 'cause you're stuck on repeat. There's nothing that I did, it's all in your head. And we can just go up and solve this in bed tonight.
Once all the sides of the bed frame were attached, I mounted the frame on top of the 2 pieces that will form the false front of our cabinet when the Murphy bed is closed.
I need to figure out a way to love like we did before. Like we did before.
Next, we moved on to the cabinet body. I started by installing the bed stop hardware that ensures when your Murphy bed is closed, it sits flush. Moving down to the lower portion of the cabinet sides, this is where you will install the other half of your pivot hardware. It is this point that the pivot point on your bed frame will connect to and allow the bed to rotate. Just like elsewhere, it's 2 screws and 2 bolts. Now, the other technically challenging piece of this build is the shock upper mounting point on the cabinet body sides. The challenge of this is you need to route, chisel, or drill out a recessed slot in your cabinet sides to hold the piece. For me, the easiest way to do this was to use my small trim router with an edge guide attachment to keep it a specified distance from the front edge and parallel to that edge. I marked the start and stop points up and down on the cabinet side, and then just went slow. If freehanding a router intimidates you, then I would suggest drilling out a few holes for this slot with a Forstner bit, and then chiseling the rest. With the slot routed, I used the hardware to mark holes for where to attach it. This piece gets threaded through bolts in both holes to give it the added strength that it needs. The last tweak to make to the sides of your cabinet is at the very bottom and back to account for your baseboards if you have them, in order to make the whole cabinet sit flush against the wall. You could notch out the baseboards in your room, but I chose instead to notch out the bottom of my cabinet. That way, if we ever removed this Murphy bed, we would not have to replace the baseboards. I went ahead and made a rough template of how much I would need to cut off using a scrap piece of plywood and checking it against the baseboard in the office where this Murphy bed was going. I then used that template as a guide to cut out the necessary slot using my jigsaw. More freehand cutting, but at least this time it's straight lines and on the bottom and back of your cabinet, where you will not see it much. I repeated these steps for the opposite side of the cabinet, and this time I even busted out my chisel to help clean up a minor spot where I slipped with the router. Hardware mounted on the cabinet sides, I moved on to the top. This piece plays a critical role in the entire build as it is the main part of the structure that we mounted to the wall. Without it, your bed would collapse on itself when you open and close it. That means take your time, use lots of glue, and some good hardware to ensure that this thing is built solidly. Now, the center of the top is meant to sit 3/4 of an inch up on the front and back pieces. Easiest way I found to do this is to use some plywood spacer blocks to lay underneath the top and raise it up when mounting things together. The top was the final piece that you have to assemble before your bed is technically complete, so I moved on to sanding and went over every single piece, working my way up in grit. But we won't show all of that. Now that is where the plans offered by Create a Bed stop on the build of this Murphy bed. And you can technically stop there if you want to, but you will be left with a wall-mounted bed that does not look like much other than a wall-mounted bed. And if you don't want that, it's up to you to get creative. I wanted my piece to look like a set of built-in cabinets, and the way I did that was to make false cabinet door fronts. I experimented with a few different styles, laying out the fascia pieces onto the front of the bed frame to visually see how things looked and find what I liked. I encourage you to do the same. Ultimately, I went with a style that looked like 2 short, wide cabinets sitting above a set of 4 tall and skinny cabinets. These false faces are not structural to the build at all, so I mounted everything just using wood glue and headless pin nails. One thing to keep in mind if you design your own false cabinet style is that Create a Bed recommends the handles you use to open the bed be positioned around 5 feet tall for optimal leverage when trying to lower the bed. With my false fascia pieces mounted, I moved on to drilling out the holes for the handles for each of my fake cabinets. This not only aids in disguising the Murphy bed's true nature, but also serves to function as the handles for lowering the bed. To ensure all of the cabinet handles were positioned accurately and evenly for each cabinet, I built a quick drill guide template that I could place inside of my fascia pieces and get a repeatable alignment for each of the handles away from the surrounding fascia. I then went back and covered up all the marks left by the pin nails I used. An easy way to conceal these tiny holes is with a little bit of wood glue in the hole. You can then sand lightly over top before the wood glue dries, and the sawdust mixed with the glue dries together and blends into the surrounding area. It can even accept stain if you decide to do that when you finish your piece. A good example of always double check yourself before you cut or drill. I discovered that I had accidentally measured for one of my pivot hardware pieces from the back of the cabinet side instead of from the front. So I had to go back and drill new mounting points and then fill the original mounting points with some dowels glued in and trimmed flush. Next came the arduous process of finishing this behemoth of a piece. Originally, my wife and I were leaning to a slightly white tinge for the piece that preserved more of the wood grain. I had heard good things about Rubio Monocoat's cotton white and decided to give that a go. Unfortunately, when all was said and done, we ended up not liking the color very much. It left everything looking too close to an unfinished piece of work, and unless you got really close to the piece, you could hardly even tell there was any white. It's probably something to do with the maple plywood not having enough pores to absorb the finish. All that meant, much to my chagrin, that I got the lucky fortune to finish this piece not once, but twice. For the second go around, we decided to paint the piece. We went with what Sherwin-Williams is calling their Krypton Blue, as the room we put this in already has bluish walls, and we thought it would be a good fit. And once again, this will help conceal the piece as just another cabinet. Now, I unfortunately forgot to hit record when we did the final assembly in the room. Rookie mistake, I know. But that doesn't mean I can't give you some tips from our assembly. The plans walk you through the steps if you do buy the Create A Bed, but I'll walk you through how we did it and some recommendations that I can make. Now, we use 3 people to do this. At a bare minimum, you're going to need 2 people that are strong enough to be able to lift this up because you're actually going to assemble everything laying down flat on the floor. Now, it's probably best for me to explain this with this bed frame open so that you can kind of visualize how things are going to be for yourself when you go to assemble them. You'll start with all 5 of your main assembled pieces flat on the floor. So your bed frame, the 2 sides of your cabinet, this headboard, and the top will be all laying out on the floor, not connected to each other. You'll want to remove both of these stops. We'll get to why in a second. You'll start by pushing your 2 sides onto their pivot mounting points on the bed frame. You will then screw in from the outside this headboard to hold the 2 side pieces together. Now, why you're going to want a couple people is the next step is to lift up just the cabinet from the floor and get it vertical while leaving the bed frame flat on the floor. While this is up and being held in place, Create A Bed says you can use clamps. Honestly, an extra set of hands will be invaluable, but you're going to need to lift up the top and hold it in place flush up here to then have somebody screw in to both of the cabinet sides the top mounting piece. Once you've got that done, you'll want the cabinet positioned about 2 to 3 feet away from the wall. You will then have somebody lift up the bed frame portion into the cabinet. And why you want these removed is so that the bed frame can actually push back further than it normally would be able to. What that's going to allow is for somebody to go behind the cabinet and come in and mount these 2 shocks. Now you want that to happen that way because when the bed is pushed in a little bit more than it's supposed to in the cabinet, the shocks are the appropriate length to easily mount onto the 2 mounting points. Then comes the fun part of shifting the whole cabinet back against the wall, screwing in to the wall. Make sure you hit some studs because otherwise when you go to open this thing up, it could just rip out of the wall and fall on you, which you don't want. And then you've got your entire cabinet assembled. The last bit of this build is to prep and mount the mattress. This involves attaching the 1/4-inch plywood that the mattress sits on top of so that it's not just contacting your bed frame supports, and then mounting the hold down straps to the foot of the bed frame. These straps are critical to ensure that your bed stays against the bed frame and doesn't fall backwards into your cabinet when you store it away. Now, for mattresses, I saw a bunch of conflicting things online. Create A Bed does specify the maximum dimensions of the mattress you can use, so bear that in mind before you buy an ultra-thick plush top mattress. But it does not say whether you should buy a memory foam, traditional spring, or pocketed coil mattress. I'm not going to pretend to be the expert here, so do your own research before buying. But from what I saw, the biggest recommendation is to avoid pocketed coil mattresses, as storing them upright for a long period of time can cause individual coils to shift. I went with a memory foam mattress, and while I've only had this Murphy bed for about a year now, it seems to be holding up just fine. I hope you've enjoyed this step-by-step how to build a Murphy bed, and stay tuned for the next Booblets Craft build.